Here we go. So, everyone, welcome to the first ever AvoinGLAM discussion. These are going to be bi-weekly events on different topics hosted from Finland, but on topics from around the world, on topics of how the actors of open knowledge can work with different types of knowledge, information, collaboration around the world. And in our first discussion, we have the topic of cultural restitution in Benin. And our invited speakers, discussion participants are Andrea Wallace is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Exeter. Her research focuses on copyright. Just a second, my notes are going behind these notifications. Just a second. Her research focuses on copyright, the digitization of cultural heritage collections, and AvoinGLAM. She writes and speaks frequently on issues of legal and ethical open access to cultural heritage and digital questions around cultural heritage restitution. And our second speaker participant is Heikki Kastenmaa from Wikimedia Finland. He is an art teacher, art writer, and Wikipedian in Helsinki, Finland. He has been a scholar in Villa Caro in Benin. He currently focuses on studying and writing local history of the southwestern district of Grand Popo in the Benin Republic. And the third participant here is Mauton Posup, who is a software developer and e-commerce specialist by profession. He's a phone language activist and a founding member of Wikimedia and the Benin user group. He has started the phone language Wikipedia and is now working at the WMF, the Wikimedia Foundation, as governance facilitator. And our fourth speaker, Fawaz Tarou, is head of training at Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie in Benin. He's a Wikimedian since 2010 and a founding member of Wikimedia and the Benin user group. He supports the phone language Wikipedia and is a member of Creative Commons Global Network. And Brigitte Vezina is a director of policy at Creative Commons. Before joining Creative Commons, she has worked as a legal officer at in the traditional knowledge division of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and advised Spark Europe and others on copyright matters. And Brigitte herself can tell more about her current work at Creative Commons. So I will hand over to Andrea, who will facilitate the discussion and clock the discussion. So I will be invisible and leave you to it. Thank you very much for joining and looking forward to this first event.
Thank you, Susanna, for the wonderful introductions and also for inviting all of us to come and have this discussion. So the event, of course, the prompt was centered around the question of who gets to decide what is digitized and how the digital reproductions can be shared online with respect to the cultural restitution questions around the Benin bronzes and also the wider questions around restitution in general. So we thought that we would start off providing a personal kind of response to this from each of our own perspectives to get the conversation going. And I think we'll begin with Mahuten, if you would like to respond to this question, and then feel free to tag someone else to move on.
Yep, sure. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure joining this discussion today. Maybe just to provide a quick background about, the 26 objects that are going to be restituted in Benin. Most of those objects are from, our king we call Behanzin. Behanzin is the one of our king who the most fight against slavery in the old time at that moment where we're still talking about slavery. And, you know, because this king, Behanzin, refused to be compliant, you know, with and refused to accept, to adapt to the slavery, they declare French people, you know, most the general of French army declare a war to him. And during that war, many of his treasures, you know, like his thrones, symbolic objects, had been stolen and bring back into France. At the moment, that the general that is called General Dodds, Amélie Dodds, said, "Okay, I have a lot of objects from that king, and now I want to give them to French government," and that is what he did. And since then, those objects had been exhibited in museums in France. In 2016, the new government from Benin said, okay, we can see our object exhibited in other countries. In France, how can we make it a way that those objects come back to our lands, because they are part of our identity, they're part of who we are. And in 2016, they make an official request to French government to have those objects. The official request, in the official request, there were many objects, more than 26, you know, but finally the French government accepted to return back 26 objects, and French Parliament, French Senate had approved the request in December of last year. Then, okay, objects will be returned back in Benin. But now the question is how the digitized objects, how we can handle that question. I look through the order that had been voted by French senators. There is no line in it, there is no word in it that express how this question should be handled, and that is sad, you know. But on my point of view, I think both physical objects and both digitized versions of those objects should all be returned to Benin and should be the property of the Benin people. And Benin people should dispose of them to say, oh, we can do of them anything we want, maybe to make them a pawn or anything. But I think the property should be back to Benin people.
Great, thank you. Fawaz, would you like to go after that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, thank you for organizing this discussion session, and it's a real pleasure for me to participate. To bold what is saying, what Mauton is saying, the report of the work that Sarah in Savoie did in France, the objects that we are talking about are more than 3,000. Exactly, I think it's 3,157. And among these objects, it's only 26 that will be returned, but they say it's to start. We will start with 26 objects. And in the report, there is no really information or recommendation about the digitizations of these objects and how it will be done and how or who will be responsible of these aspects. So I think it's an open topic that we have to discuss, and there are here more people with more skills in this aspect. So thank you for introduction, and we can start discussing.
Great, thank you. Hika, would you like to go next and also share the slides that you have prepared?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me into this discussion. My main occupation at the moment is about, I study about the history, a local history of parts of Republic of Benin. And I think it would be good for people who are interested in restitution problems and open access to cultural heritage to know what are the origins and conditions of these objects. And I want to talk about a little bit about museum practices, objects of restitutions, what they are, and then my thesis on cultural heritage and this is concerning Benin and West Africa. First of all, these are material objects. There are no proper, in Western sense, museums in Benin for that have good climate and environmental conditions for these objects, and this is what they are doing in Benin right now. They are constructing, I think, 3 main museums, and there are many kinds of museum standards and guidelines they have to take in consideration. It's just I want to remind that the climate in itself, it's not proper to preserve these objects. The objects of restitution usually fall into 3 categories, and there can be other in between categories also. The human remains. This is a very personal question. People whose relatives or close people whose remains have been restituted into another country, they want to claim the remains of this. This is not an issue we are not so much interested in, but this is what we have to know. There are already complicated international laws and international agreements concerning this area. The second thing is general called fetishes. It's more like folk art or people. There are objects made for common people, let's say. And these are in West Africa. The word fetish was made in West Africa. It's an old 16th or 17th century. That one historian studied these things, and this is a general word. The first restitution of collection is actually what I know is from Finland. A person called Matti-Juhani Karila decided to return his collection he had collected from West Africa and was presented in Finland, and now it's on show in Villakaro Museum in Benin. These are small figurines, small sculpture that have something to do with local religious beliefs and cults. But then mostly we talk between France and Benin. We talk about these power symbols. They are originally from African royal tradition. They are part of court culture. They were deprived by colonial officers. When the colonial rule came, the main idea was to diminish the African original tradition. I want to emphasize that this original African royal tradition is something we in the most Western countries don't know anything, because in our schools books, everything starts from when the European came, when the Portuguese came to Africa, and so on. We were never told in our schools that there was culture in Africa before Europeans. This is what the African museums take pride on. They are very. It's very important for Africans to emphasize this pre-colonial culture. Here is a part of a human remain collections. Well, just an example. Here is some pictures of fetishes or small figurines for occult purposes. This is on the left. You see Villa Caro Museum, Petit Museum, and small wood. These are mostly made out of wood. And here is one piece of this monarchic royal culture from this is from a picture from a museum in France. This is a royal seat. The ancient African kings, they used many seats, and they had their own sculptors, own artists, carpenters, and so on. Okay, what are my thesis about the heritage, African heritage? Can it be reclaimed? Of course, we cannot bring the original of African culture into Africa as such, because the world has changed. The people who live in these areas are not the same. But we can the idea is to re-establish the identity of the people. That is important. My thesis is that open access is not an alternative of licensing. It's a must. TC licenses are easy way. They're very complicated, as we know. Complicated actually definitions of CC licenses, but they are easy way to open publishing of the heritage, discussion of the heritage. And okay, and then what we have to ask ourselves, how can we demand open licensing or open access, and what to do with it? The open access and copyrights, they are not purpose as such. The idea is about heritage. Okay, that's
Great.
my point.
Thank you. And now we have Brigitte.
Thanks, Andrea. Well, at the risk of repeating what others have said, I'd just like to highlight a few points. And the first one is that the artifacts in question, and this is the case in very many situations, is that they are subject to many different relationships. So there's an ownership relationship. So the institution might own the physical object. As a matter of law, they have a property title over it and they've acquired it and it's part of their collection. But at the same time, there is another relationship between the object and the community or the nation to whom it belongs. So that could be a stewardship relationship or a guardianship relationship. And the context in which these objects became part of the collections of the institution did not necessarily take into account the ethics of documenting or of acquiring objects to make them part of institutions, and certainly didn't take into account that stewardship or that guardianship relationship And I think this is what might pose some problems when we are faced with the question, well, who decides what can be digitized? So the institution might have a claim saying this belongs to us, this is in our collection, we have physical possession of those objects, we might even have a property title through documents, through a chain of title that can be established. And so through that link, through that relationship, they might have a claim of digitizing, and then either for preservation purposes or in order to make it available for public access and reuse. At the same time, the community might also wish to decide based on that stewardship or that guardianship link. And so how can we reconcile these various ties that the objects may have with the institution on the one side, community on the one side, and we can even imagine more complex cases where there might be other parties involved. For example, if the researcher was also involved in collecting and donating maybe those objects to the institution, might also have some claims on the object. So we can think of very complex situations where many parties might be in a position to claim to have the right to decide not only if it can be digitized, but then what happens with the digitized version. Is it simply kept inside for preservation purposes without any public access, or for limited access, for example, for research or study, or should it be full public access for anyone to be able to reuse it in any way that they want? So it can become very complex very fast. Now, in the context of restitution, suddenly the institution no longer has that property title, right? The objects pass on and are given back. So the institution doesn't have that claim relying on property to be able to digitize. So is the institution still entitled to keep a digitized copy of the object? This, I think, is a very controversial question that we'll explore in the course of this conversation. I think we need to remember that who the institution or the entity that holds not only the physical object, but also its its digital representation might also control the narrative. By having the digital image of an object and making that available under certain conditions and in a certain context within a certain knowledge environment, the institution might have control over the stories and perpetuate sometimes some narratives that need to be corrected and maybe recontextualized. So I'd like to leave it at here for my introduction, but I look forward to answering more questions. Thanks, Andrea.
Great, thank you, Brigitte. So I'm going to go last, which is a bit difficult to follow everyone up, but also kind of touches on a number of different things that people have said, and also I think really centrally relates to how the law informs how this decision is answered. And again, if we go back to the question of who gets to decide what's digitized and how the digital reproductions can be shared online, the legal system that determines that is determined according to who has possession of the work. So having possession of the work really then filters into needing to make changes to the legal system where the work is currently hosted in order to facilitate restitution, to do all of these things that then relate to what happens with the digital reproductions. So if we look at the specific set of objects that are kind of a discussion here today, what happened in France and the recent legislation that went through is one of these barriers that kind of led to there needing to be a legislative act is that there is within French constitutional law this idea of the inalienation of public property. So public property cannot be sold off, it belongs to the public. And essentially that also kind of replicates a power imbalance because it puts one public kind of above the other when we're thinking about who has access, who owns, and who controls the narratives around these objects. But there's a few different approaches when we're thinking about how the law can be changed. So there could potentially be a constitutional amendment that brings something in that allows the alienation of public property for the purposes of restitution, or even thinking about how we design systems that allow property that was previously taken to be restored to the rightful owners. That would be a broad constitutional amendment. We could also have a broad piece of legislation that then creates an act through which people can apply for legal ownership of these works, and we start the legal process in a way that the country in possession then validates the ownership and transfers it to the host community. Or in this instance, it's a very narrow piece of legislation that is specifically around 26 objects. So it allows the alienation of those objects to be returned. So this all kind of relates to the digital questions, because my colleague Mathilde Pavis and I wrote a response to the SAR Savoy report, which was, essential in getting a global conversation started around this, and really pushing all of us forward on this thinking, but didn't actually consider some of the digital questions, which probably were not, obviously within the scope of all of it. But there's a huge piece of law that exists everywhere called copyright that we have to think about when we're thinking also about the digital aspects that are related to all the material objects. So even the restitution of the digital materials, or the fact that where something is digitized will control who then is able to claim authorship in the digital object, charge for access to license the work. So we have these kind of digital replication of all of these power imbalances, if those questions are not also considered along with the material culture. And this is so relevant because there are huge benefits to open access, but I think there are also some really interesting drawbacks, particularly when we make images available under open access that technically someone could claim copyright in and charge licensing fees around, which should be the right of the people who are associated with those objects, in a way that Western institutions have been doing for centuries, right? So when we release the images under open access parameters, it potentially can undermine some of that market. So these are some of the interesting questions that we thought we would potentially explore. At the same time, there's like the big W in the room, which is Wikipedia, which has been crucial to thinking about knowledge equity, knowledge justice, and replicating and reclaiming the narratives around so many of these works. And images are so essential for doing that and for allowing that research to kind of go forward. So I think that's kind of the heart at what we're talking about today, thinking about some of these tensions. And I think with that, we might move on to our second question, which is, what are some of the legal hangups that complicate this area? And I think, this could be broad in terms of like even visa and travel restrictions around how we're able to access these objects in order to take photos and this sort of thing, all the way to the very narrow questions around copyright and other barriers that can potentially mediate how knowledge is produced around these works. So if anyone would like to begin with that, please feel free to step forward. Otherwise, I will just tag somebody. Yay, Brigitte, go right ahead.
I'm happy to go first, yes. Yeah, I'd like to mention maybe the controversies over the public domain characterization of these objects. So if we look at copyright law and we make a very crude distinction that would need to be refined, of course, but if we want to take it as simple as possible, the copyright system might categorize objects either as protected under copyright or in the public domain. As I said, this is very crude, but for the purposes of this conversation, I think it suffices to keep it at that. Once things are in the public domain, they are no longer protected, or they never were protected. That means that they're free for anyone to use. Anyone can copy them, adapt them, transform them, make use of them in any way that they please. With these objects that probably were never protected by copyright because copyright didn't exist at the moment that they were created, or because copyright has lapsed, they are considered to be in the public domain. And so the public might have expectations to be able to reproduce them, to adapt them, and to do all sorts of acts and reuses that they might please. However, this dichotomy of opposing public domain, i.e. free to reuse, and copyright protected does not take into account other considerations that might attach to these objects. So even though they might be considered in the public domain from a copyright perspective, there might be other rules that govern who can access them and who can do what with them. Those considerations might arise from ethics, but also from customary law of the community whose objects belong to. There could be cultural rights, sometimes the indigenous rights to their cultural heritage might be involved. So I think that when we see the word public domain and we think about all the freedoms that are associated with them, we also need to think about other restrictions that may not arise out of the copyright system, but other, like I said, traditional laws or customary laws or protocols. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we look at public domain. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely free to use, because other concerns or considerations need to be taken into account. I'll leave it at that and I'll let others speak.
Great. Well, maybe we could, oh, sorry, Heike, would you like to go? Or who was it? Was it Mahuden? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Great, go ahead.
So I think that Brigitte, you just point out many important questions here. You know, in Benin, the latest copyright law we voted was in 2006, I think, and in that law, it protects anything regarding folklore, anything regarding cultural elements. So we were discussing about this, I think, yesterday with Fawaz. We can't normally take, you know, photo and even share them on commons on everything that is cultural in Benin, because they are covered by that law. Okay, those objects we are bringing back in Benin, on my point of view, they are already in the public domain. But the question is also, we don't know once they'll be back in our country regarding the legislation we have there in place. Even if there could be some restriction, you know, because they can say, okay, those objects are really specific. Those objects are, you know, are really something that we are attached to, and we don't need people to share them more. Or also some rules, specific rules, just to you know, to forbid you know, museum for example, other museum for other countries to use you know, the digitized version of them can be set in place. So we don't really know now what will really happen, but we, as me, as Wikimedian, I do hope that they should stay in public domain as they are, and with open access to it, because we need to share knowledge of them. When I was at school in Benin, I did never see those objects. I had the opportunity to see them only once when I come in France, in Paris. And now I think it's the same thing for every Beninese, because no one never see them. So we should make them public. People cannot drive to go to museum. People can, so we need to make them public, digitalized, and make them accessible for everyone. That's my point of view.
Okay, thank you, Mahuden. So, the first issue we faced when we started creating a Wikipedia article about the 26 objects was to find the pictures of each object, and only few of those objects were available on Creative Commons, but all of the object pictures were available on K. Brownlee Museum website. But in the terms of this website, it's clearly mentioned that you cannot use these pictures for public use. You only have the right to use them for your personal use only, and after that you have to delete all of those pictures. So after the restitution, will those pictures still available on the K. Brownlee's website? Will these terms change about the restitute object? These are some questions that I can ask if we can find answers to those questions. Thanks.
Yes. To make it simple, when an object is moved from France to Benin, does the law concerning its possession changes? And it's maybe can we take picture? We can take pictures in France, in Paris Museum, but in Benin, no. At the moment, well, at least well, how the legislation over there is. And my notion also is that most of the museums of Benin nowadays, they are, well, their governance is let's say either so-called private museums, mostly. They have association or foundation in the background. I don't know if there are any, like, it's very usual that we have also cities or the government in Europe owns a museum. Nowadays, it's very common that they have made foundations, even the government have made this called public foundations. Now, it's important to know who owns the museums, how the governance of your museum is done, because the museum can also, to some extent, regulate the people's behavior and things like this within the museums. For example, I have many pictures from Beninois museums in commons, but they are almost all of them are from outside, no inside or object pictures.
So I think this actually raises a really interesting point, which is relevant to like the material access to the work to be able to digitize it. And also thinking about some of the regulations that each institution will do differently in terms of what they allow people to do with the photos that are taken inside the museum. And there was even a court case on this in the EU and Germany, where there was a Wikipedia editor who took photos of public domain paintings and uploaded them, and was found by the highest court in Germany to have violated the contract that was extended to him by the institution when he took the photos that he was supposed to be using for his personal use and uploaded them to Wikipedia, even though they potentially were his photos that he should have control over. So this is a very interesting dynamic when we're trying to think about how we get access to the digital images or create the digital images in order to populate the Wikipedia articles and to allow people to study and write about them. Which then, goes to the Creative Commons questions in terms of the Wikipedia licenses that are defaults for uploading images to Creative Commons. Which is the CC BY SA license at the highest level. Obviously, people can release images under more open levels, but it really then becomes important in terms of open access that if institutions make those images available under licenses that can be uploaded to Wikipedia, we then remove a lot of those other barriers in trying to get access ourselves. So I think, you know, we've had some other discussions around this too, but maybe we could move on to the next question, where we think about how open access can both improve and complicate things. When we're thinking about the question of digitization, like even the decision to digitize something in and of itself, especially when we go to some of the questions that Heike was talking about with ancestral remains, and even the questions of open access, you know, what levels of open access are appropriate, who should be making that decision, and thinking about both the benefits and the risks of open access around, you know, these materials in terms of everything that we're having a discussion about. So if anyone would like to jump on and respond to that, because they have, you know, a burning response, please do.
My idea, well, what we could do as Wikipedia, let's say Wikipedians, for example, is to okay, let's create articles by words. There are quite a few sources available for these objects. They are very famous, and they can be accessed. The sources can be accessed. Okay, let's start writing. No photos. That's it. You know, as a strategy to try to suggest more. Maybe later, people realize that these are important objects, and we can convey that also picture. We want the people want to start demanding. Okay, we want to see the pictures of the objects. How about that?
What I can say as idea is, yes, my point of view is I would like them to be freely open and freely accessible. I know it should be the good one, but I also know that this can raise other questions, like if we make them openly accessible. Let's say Museum of Cape Branly can say, okay, they are all accessible. I can bring them and I can also do another exhibition. You know, maybe we can make them all accessible, but also with some restriction law and saying, okay, if you are a museum, you cannot use them to make an exhibition, something like that, because as Beninese, I would like really that those objects belong fully and becomes fully the property of Benin, you know. And any museum that can share them, any museum that can use them in exhibition should be Beninese museum. Maybe, I know there can be others partnership to lend some objects for some times, but anything should be well framed in a legal scope, you know. And in a practical way, yes, we should start doing something like writing articles on Wikipedia, but also I think we need to raise awareness about toward our government. And we as Wikimedians of Benin, we are a recognized association, legal association in Benin. And I think we can write an official letter about this topic and saying, we think that there is something that is important. We need to share knowledge. We need you as government, when those objects are back in our country, then make them accessible to everyone, to school students, to teachers. So that could be the best way we can share our culture. If so, we are attached to that. That's my idea.
Would anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
And I see somewhat, I am somewhat reluctant to speak of these things as objects, because they used to be parts of life culture, parts of everyday life and everyday practices. and we should, what do you call, objectification of these objects. There is a, they will become fetishes in a way, museum fetishes now again, and it's well, we should try to find how to connect these with real life, real history, maybe trying to research who made them, how were they used originally, and so on. Not only objects.
Please.
Yes. Thanks, Heiki. I also think that creating article on all the objects or can be a good start, and open access will also help to have a sustainable conservation of these articles, and to help to share them everywhere. And even for those who are not in Benin, the people from Benin who are in other countries, because today you have to go to Cape Branly, for example, to see those objects. But if it's open access, I can take pictures to illustrate the article, because if you only read the text, you cannot really imagine how these objects looks, etc. I think that open the access could be a great thing for those objects. Thanks.
Yes, just to add a word to what Fuad just said. Okay, for the article, really good point. I think we should do that. And then, you know, on those objects, they are made of other small symbols. For example, when you take the royal seat, there are some, you know, some kind of flowers. Those flowers have their own meaning. So describing the object in its global, you know, way, on the article, we also need to go deeper in detail to say, this object is made of, I don't know, this flower is made of this bird. That bird had a special meaning in our culture in Benin. They are not there only to make, I don't know, art thing. They mean something, and there are expression of power. You know. So describing like that, okay, people can read, but they can really see exactly. So that's why we need picture to illustrate them.
And I think we have to thank the Cape Branly and the France people for the great job already done about the description of all the objects, because we have some description of the objects in the report. We have the list of the object, and for each object on the Cape Branly site, for example, we have a description of each object. And I think that a Wikipedia article could be a start point to have more information about all the pictures or the part of these objects, as Malton was saying.
I feel like there's a lot of actually important threads that tie together, and even thinking about Wikipedia as a way to link between the articles so that people are able to better make those connections. When you're talking about the different meanings between some of, you know, the flowers and the birds, and relating that to the wider ecosystem of knowledge that's on Wikipedia. And I think also there's, so I picked up on a couple of points. I think that Mahoutin said that was thinking about, you know, the visibility aspect of all of this and how important it is to be able to say, like, these things are important and look at this. And we have to the government, to the people who were engaging with it online. But that was also something that was really important to the authors of the SARS of Web report. They made it available as open access rather than, to kind of submit it and not deposit it online in a way that others would be able to read it, because they knew like this is something that should be available, has a lot of history and information around different ways that will be useful for other people. So there's a, kind of a great metaphor around that as well. But also, we're thinking about the objects themselves. And I agree with some of the terminology that we're using because it seems, so sterile. But thinking also about the associated materials around them, some of the archival photos and things that could be important to, the broader context of these stories too. And especially when we think about some things that may not be returned, if that stuff is made available as open access, because it allows people to be able to establish the restitution claims and access the evidence that is necessary, in order to make the case and develop, the claim for who they should be returned to. So there's a lot of really interesting threads, I think, that are connecting everyone here. So let's move on to the last question, and then we can kind of open it up. I think there's a couple that are kind of related. So we wanted, before we start, just kind of take questions from the audience. We were thinking, Brigitte posed a wonderful question. Is digitization an end to a means or a means to an end? Because, what are our real goals here? And even thinking maybe a bit broadly about what we think needs to be a bigger part of the conversation as, we work towards this all together. So not that that's an easy question to answer, but feel free to jump on.
I can try to answer my own question, but I'm more curious in hearing what others have to say, and also what participants in the audience might think. But yeah, I thought about this question because it often seems that open access is seen as a goal in itself. That once something is made openly accessible, ta-da, that's it. We've reached our goal, and it solves all the problems, and all wonderful things can happen. But I was interested in knowing what are these wonderful things that we want to happen. So when a decision is made to make an object online openly accessible, what are the overarching goals, or what is the impact that we're trying to get to? I can think of enabling the community itself to have access to its own heritage. So when the objects are hosted in an institution outside of the community, that might be a way for the community to have access. It's also a means for the public to have access to cultural heritage, as part as the universal right to access to cultural heritage, which is an important part of human social development. I think it serves several public interest purposes like research and study and knowledge generation and sharing. There's so much benefits for conversations and knowledge building to occur, and this is facilitated when these objects are made openly accessible, because collaborations are enhanced and then progress can be made on interpreting and understanding those objects. And then I was wondering also if there were any drawbacks to this open access. So was it Mahuton who mentioned the symbolism in some of the flowers and the birds? And I was wondering, well, what if that symbolism is then reused but out of context? What if some elements that are not just ornamental or just decorative, but that have maybe a spiritual or even sometimes a sacred meaning? What happens if they are being reused out of context in ways that contradict that original meaning? Can new meaning be built, and will that always be in line with the expectations and the interests of the community? I guess it's in this perspective that I was interested to see, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve in making those objects openly accessible? And are we not also opening the door to some uses that might not be that might be problematic or that might not be beneficial. So I'm looking forward to what others think.
Just to bring my point of view as Beninese, as someone who went to school in Benin and has been educated in Benin culture. When in public school in Benin, we teachers story of Benin, and in that story we have a part of kings in Benin. But I don't remember one time teacher show us a picture, a photo, an image of all those objects. Always text, always the words, nothing visual to visualize. And on thinking about opening access, I think when we do that, we can achieve that objective. Because each year in Benin, at the end of the school year, we need to travel to make some kind of, long travel to go to museum over there, kilometers and kilometers, and to go there one day long to visit those museums, to see them by our eyes. To make that travel, we need money. Family need money. They don't have money. For student security, making all long travel in buses with roads and that are not secure, we can prevent family, people, money and security by making them digitalized. Simply, I think teacher can take pictures of those things, those objects, and show them in the class when they're teaching. Why can them use Wikipedia article that are writing and say, oh, has support for the teaching, for the lessons, Wikipedia article can be those support, and images we put on commons can illustrate. Now, if someone wants to go and to see by his own eyes, that could be something but he wants by his own. But, in the current state, it is a little bit sad that we need to travel when to access those objects. So I think making them open access will help us really in our education path. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Malton. Thanks, Brigitte, too. My point of view is that, sorry, I will start with the question. Are those kind of objects in or under open access in France or in other countries? I would like to dig this point before asking our authorities to put those objects under open access because as Brigitte was saying, it could be very important and useful to put those objects under open licenses, but it could also create other problems to do this. We have to take in account the best and the worst to act. But it's just in this moment that I was thinking about this. If those objects are back in Benin and our authorities create the environment to share these information or these objects within the people in the country, but protect them against the other peoples. Won't this kind to act, be better for us and to protect those objects. But it's just my mind of the moment. But I'm Mauto, sorry, I will finish. But I agree with you. We have to open access to share this information and to help people to get access, etc. But this is it's just some questions that I'm asking myself. So you can go on, Mauto.
Yes, yes, thank you for that. Sure, sure. I'm okay. We need to create a scope, a legal scope around all this, even if we are talking about open access. But I think all those objects are already in the public domain. So I don't know what should stop us making them accessible. I don't know. I don't know. Sure, we should find solution to prevent reuse, to use abusive use, or I don't know. But sure, let's make it open. They are already in the public domain, and also at that time when those objects were created, there were no legal right that prevent people going to see them. I thought that if they had, all the technology we have today, they could make them as accessible. Because at that time you can go to museum, you can go there, you can watch by your eyes. Nobody will stop you to see them by your eyes. And I think we should be the same thing today. Now that we have the technology and to make them accessible, and it's also a part of our culture. If we want people to know who we are, to know more about us, we also know to make our culture available for people to see. That's my point.
Okay, thanks. So to come back to my open licenses advocate. So, in among these objects, there is a geographical aspect. During the war that you were talking about in the beginning, our kings of Dahomey went to the north of the country, for example, and bring or back some objects from those part of the country. And General Dodds could have taken some object from north of the country when he were taking object in Dahomey and bring all those objects to France. So open access could help people from north to discover those objects that has already been stolen by Dahomey kings. And I think it would be very important and very useful to open access for those objects. Thank
you. Then we join the same fight of ours. Good.
Yes, yes. I'm always with you.
Heike, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, it's in principle it is like Fava said, but also it's complicated. It's also very, very complicated issue. At the time when there was this Franco-Dahomean war, when the Dahomean kingdom was taken by France, the idea of warfare was that the remains of war, they were tributary objects was usual when conquered country that you could rob and take anything from and especially the symbols of power. It says that was at the time. Also, one point about policy of restitution. There's only some tens of objects being returned to Benin. I think this is a policy of Emmanuel Macron, who initiated this idea. I think he wants to see that the process is somehow started. We have only some 26 objects, right? Some concrete objects. We want to see concrete results. But this, I hope, and I think his idea is also that this will spread into other museums, other countries in Europe, Germany, England, in Portugal, in very many places, and it will be. I hope it will become a very important issue in international issues. Also, not only talk, but also actions, concrete returns, repatriations happening. But this is a complicated issue, and it will take years and years. But at least the official initiation is here now.
So I'm going to be like the super academic in my response and be like, I feel, really interested by this conversation, because I think there's a really interesting opportunity when we're thinking about digitization as being a means to an end or an ends to a mean, and what our goals are, to think like, beyond and super future about potentially where we want things to be and to work back from there. And one of those things that I think becomes really interesting is when we think about digitization and even open access as like a methodology that we really think critically about, and how we're doing some of these things in a way that we disrupt some of the status quo, and the way that we have even been reproducing works and thinking about them as faithful reproductions, and how copyright can kind of like regulate that. So that we get to that point, because, as we've all been discussing, there's a lot of complications around some of these things, but we can imagine, these futures in a way that allow us to get there. And in the meantime, maybe shake up some of the filters that continue us down the path, without kind of thinking super creatively around some of these things. So one of those, to me, is like this idea of what like a faithful reproduction is about the photograph of the work and the object, and then how we read that and experience that, and how that impacts how we understand, the object itself and the culture and the knowledge associated with it. Like, why do we just think about the photograph as being the best way, or even like a 3D reproduction and scan, to kind of experience everything that's associated with the object and the cultural heritage? So I think, that to me is one part of it. But then the other part of it is that, I think what's really missing from this conversation is reparations, because, as we've discussed in terms of having the infrastructure or the technology to be able to digitize things and to think about like some of these questions and the goals and where we want to go, like the histories of colonization and the wealth extraction that has occurred. And even when we break it down to travel and people who have been attracted to institutions and to specific economic areas and have, contributed to those economies, to go and visit, these works, could have been going to someone else this entire time, right? So some of these things are obviously far beyond the question of this today, but I really like to kind of think about what that future could be to then work back. And this question that, Brigitte posed, I thought was just such a wonderful, wonderful way to think kind of some of this through. So we do have a question in the chat, and Susanna has asked, how does the upcoming safeguard of the public domain play out in this case between the public domain and protection in Europe and then various African countries, which is a really interesting question. Brigitte, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think it circles back to my initial comment, where we might have different layers of and different right owners over the same object. So let's take, for example, a sculpture that might be considered in the public domain because it was created, let's say, 200 years ago. However, when we digitize that object, either through photography or scan, we create another work that might be protected by copyright. In other words, we create a layer of rights in the digitization. And Andrea calls these digital surrogates. So the digital twin, if as it were, of the physical object may be protected by copyright, while the physical object is in the public domain. So we have this kind of dual status where the physical object is in the public domain, but the digital surrogate is protected by copyright. And when we do make that digital object available, accessible, we want to make it as openly accessible as possible. And therefore, by granting as many, as little or few restrictions as possible, and therefore maybe even releasing it back into the public domain. So at Creative Commons, we argue that any faithful reproduction, so reproductions that would not be original in the copyright sense, if it's a simple photography that doesn't require any skills or any, that doesn't qualify as original work. I can hear some background noise. It's okay. We believe that this digital reproduction should not be protected by copyright, should also be in the public domain. So physical and digital surrogate should be in the public domain. However, there might be some institutions that still want to claim copyright in that object, and therefore will apply either full copyright or more restrictive Creative Commons licenses. And I think this is interesting to have as a conversation. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on this, but I think that there is a tension here in revitalizing and enriching and celebrating the public domain, and at the same time imposing restrictions simply because of that layer of rights that is generated through the digitization process.
Just a short comment also on this question. There are many kinds of laws concerning copyright in Europe, but then there are many laws in Africa, and there are many countries there where there are no laws. I suppose when there's no law, it means the museums or the owners of these objects can specify what are the rights.
So actually, that's, I think, a perfect summation, and also really important to think about in terms of like the territoriality of copyright, because some areas that'll be harmonized. So there's certain rules that'll exist for everyone in the EU, but there's also certain rules that will be different between every single member state country. And this obviously, applies to all the different countries within Africa that will each have their own copyright rules too. And that, copyright and public domain. So some public domain laws will differ as well. And I think one of the things also that Suzanne is asking about is the Article 14 provision of the Digital Single Market Directive, which should go into effect this year, which says that works of visual art that are reproduced cannot be protected unless they meet the copyright threshold for copyright protection. So what this really does is just eliminate some of the lesser and related rights that member states might recognize in some of the digital reproductions of work. But it's interesting because, especially as applied to this set of objects, these 26 three-dimensional objects, right? Are these works of art, works of visual art, under the way that the definition of the provision would maybe pose them to be, or even because instead of it being like of 2D work, they're 3D. So there's a lot more scope for copyright to arise in that image. And these are going to be some other really interesting questions, I think, that start to arise around some of those things that aren't, as straightforward as an answer. But it also goes back to what Brigitte was saying in terms of copyright arises automatically. So if people would like to claim copyright, it is technically seen as their right to do so. How you then decide whether or not that right is valid is in a court, which is why there are so few of these cases that actually go to court to litigate the status of the reproduction and the work. So we'll see, I guess, is the answer to that. And actually, I'm really excited. I can't wait. But how does that help us, when we're thinking about the specific set of objects? Because if we were thinking about all of the digital reproductions of these 26 objects that are at the Musée Quai Branly, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So great question. I would just also ask us to maybe think about another question that Brigitte had posed to us, but maybe thinking about what are our recommendations going forward, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So it could be really interesting to start to think about what those next steps are, especially that we know that these 26 objects are going back. How are we going to build, the space on Wikipedia or in other digital spaces that we all want to see around these objects, and what does that kind of collaboration look like?
And may I comment this? We should create a strategy for the years to come for this, because hopefully this is just the beginning of the repatriation, and hopefully it will be a strategy that will last, within our communities.
I will speak about what is happening in Benin. I don't have some more information about the other countries of Africa, but I know that in Benin we don't have so much laws about public domain or protection. There are the information that we have is, I think, only about the FOP, the freedom of panorama, etc. And I think a couple of years, they were talking about how many years a book or some arts could fall into public domain. But we don't have so many more information about how to proceed or what will happen with this or those information. It's very subject to be digged in Benin. Thanks.
In a long run, in a way, I see that Benin is now a showcase of this repatriation, because, well, Benin is considered as a small country. It's only 12 million people in an African measures, but still, if this thing continues, there will be many other West African and African nations that will influence. But now Benin is will be in very central position, and it's very important that we take. Also, it's important that we keep up a question. It has a value as itself to what is public domain, what is public access, what is open access, what is cultural heritage. Things we have discussed today. They have I have a sense of that they have a end of itself in a way.
I know that the law of 2006 answers some of those questions. It is a law dedicated to copyright in Benin and also to freedom of panorama question.
Yeah.
So it's right that every question is not covered yet, but there is a legal framework, a legal that is in place. In fact, by default, everything is forbidden in Benin. So even you go to museum, you cannot take photo, it is forbidden. But anything that is cultural, that is part of folklore, culture of Benin, is forbidden to be reproduced in a digital way. And what I think is we need to, I come back to my idea to also raise awareness, just only to make decision takers to think about some question. Just to ask them, okay, you ask to have those 26 objects back in Benin, and French government accept. How you think about this question of digitization? How you think about opening access? How do you plan to manage those questions? They just also have, maybe they have some plan, we don't know. Maybe just bring those questions to their attention to know what are their thoughts, what are their plans about that. And also, I think as Wikipedia, we need also, this not only covers the 26 objects, but any object that is in our museum, that is part of our culture. I think we can do a program like Wikipedia in residency. I started that program, I think, 2 years ago, and we talked about this with Eiki, how we can make Wikipedia go into our culture at the deepest heart of our culture and write articles. As museum, we need to illustrate those articles. Maybe for 1 month, we can send one article, one Wikipedia that we stay in a museum in Benin for 1 month and write articles about those objects, our culture, and illustrate them. Maybe that can raise awareness and tell people we need them, people need them, schoolboys, school students need them, teachers need them, the world need them, easily, because we need to share those.
Thank you, everybody. Brigitte, do you want to jump on with one last Creative Commons hat comment?
Well, what I could reiterate is that, yeah, Creative Commons is fostering open access to cultural heritage as much as possible, because we do think that it opens a host of possibilities for reuse and participation in cultures in ways that would not be possible otherwise, because access to the physical object is limited, as you said many times over the course of this seminar. And so we do believe that the benefits of making that cultural heritage openly accessible online is humongous. Creative Commons offers licenses and tools to communicate how that cultural heritage can then be reused by the public. And the ones that we recommend for posting or making available objects online are tools and not technically licenses. So the first is CC0, which is a dedication to the public domain. So in other words, if there are rights in the digital reproduction, we, as I already mentioned, we advise that the institution or whoever makes that digitization releases those rights into the public domain, releases that work in the public domain, and waives the rights. And the other tool that's available is called the public domain mark, which is not, again, technically a license, it's a label that the ones making the object available can apply to the object to indicate to the public that it is in the public domain, and therefore all the freedoms associated with that status are available to whoever might want to use or reuse those objects. And If anyone would like more information on how Creative Commons tools and licenses are applied in relation to cultural heritage, I'm happy to answer any questions, maybe by email or otherwise after this webinar.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that we kind of had been discussing is creating like the MetaWiki page around some of this to track and document the things that are happening in the meantime. But also, I really liked Mahutin's recommendation around the Wikipedian in residence, because in a way, when we think about the access and whoever takes the photograph, whoever digitizes things, then has the ability to release it open access. That not only like reduces some of those barriers, but it seems like an amazing way to create new digital reproductions around these works that then can be used to populate Wikipedia articles, but that's actually, I think, an amazing way to think about some of the, like, all of the work that has to be done for restitution, but what are those things that we can be doing in the meantime to start things now? And that's, I think, a great example of one. So I personally don't really have any recommendations or expectations other than I just want to see and follow everything that everyone's doing because I'm a researcher. So please always tell me. But again, thank you everyone for your input. And I'll thank Susanna again for inviting us to have this discussion and invite you back if you'd like to say anything in terms of closing comments.
Well, this doesn't have to be the end. This is just the beginning. As Andrea mentioned, in all the notes and advertisements about this event, there's a link to the project page in MetaWiki. And we really invite you to express your ideas and thoughts in there. And I think it's a very good place to continue the discussion around this topic. And well, you do have the opportunity to speak out if you wish. Hands are invited. We are a little bit over time, but if you have something that you want to say, you still have the opportunity. No one feels brave enough to go over time. Anyway, as I said, please join us there in the wiki page. All the channels that you find in any of these notifications are also free to use. And also please follow AvoinGLAM. We are starting new activities in Finland. And really also hope that we can build some collaboration around these issues globally. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording first.